Hi everybody, I figured I would give this a shot today, see how one of these works. So just to remind everybody where we had kind of left off as we had been talking about different flow patterns and basically how blood could go from the heart to the arteries to the vessel to the capillaries back to the veins and venules, and where I kind of left us off was blood pressure. Uh, to me, one of the tougher physiologic concepts that we're going to deal with here. This first show is just going to be kind of taking a little look at how basically what is blood pressure, how do we measure it, and before we start getting into how we actually physiologically regulate it. So blood pressure, like it says on the screen here, is really just the pressure of the blood against the walls of the vessel. Uh, Generally, what we're going to see is blood pressure is going to be highest near the heart, and we're going to see a gradient as it works from there back down to the capillaries and veins. It's going to be highest closest to the heart, and actually back at its lowest as we're getting back to the heart in that superior and inferior vena cava. Uh, what we're going to see within the blood vessels is generally on those vessels that are close to the heart, like the arteries, the closer you are to the heart, the more we're going to see an actual pulse pressure. And what this is going to mean is you're going to get a little spike up when the heart is in systole, and it's going to drop back down when it's in diastole. And again, if we're talking about systemic blood pressure, that's mainly going to be the left ventricle. So like it says here, systolic pressure is when that ventricle is actually in contraction. That's going to generate that pressure spike that's going to travel through. And if you're actually putting your hand, let's say, on your radial pulse here, you're actually, that is feeling that pressure wave that's traveling down through. As we work further and further through the system, we are going to see that the pressure is going to kind of continue to drop and continue to drop. And as we are getting closest to returning back to the heart, we are actually going to see that the pressure is dropping almost closer back to zero. So the diastolic pressure, when we're looking at blood pressure readings, this is when the arteries are actually in full, not the arteries, the ventricles in full diastole. And again, if you've ever had your blood pressure taken, which I'm sure almost everybody has, you are going to see generally that 120/80 reading. That is your systolic over diastolic. So what that is really meaning is your systolic reading, if you're doing the blood pressure cuff, say right here, that 120 reading is going to be the highest pressure in millimeters of mercury, which I always think is kind of a funny measurement because in reality, nobody really knows what a millimeter of mercury is in terms of pressure. Like as a common layperson wouldn't know that at all. I've looked it up before. It's like 0.8 psi, so it's not a particularly high pressure, but it's enough to move our blood around. But when you're looking at 120/80, that 120 is going to be the highest pressure that is being generated during systole. So that is kind of the peak of the pressure, where the 80, if that's your diastolic number, is going to be when the heart is in full relaxation and the pressure is dropped as low as it's going to get. That is that low point. Like I said, the pulse pressure is the difference between those. So 120/80, you would see your pulse pressure would be 40. And again, that's just kind of showing you how much difference is there. So if you were like 130/80, your pulse pressure would be 50, for example. And again, pulse pressure is going to be highest closest to the heart. As we move further and further away, it is going to continue to drop, continue to drop. Again, it's going to depend on what's going on there. At rest, that 120/80 is kind of the standard number, or at least average. We're going to see with exercise and other stuff like that, this may change. The other thing is, you get older, your arteries tend to, just like about everything else, get less flexible, and you're going to see that it's going to cause bigger changes in pulse pressure. And again, like I said, feeling that pulse, that is that pressure wave that's traveling down through, because with the blood being made mainly of water, and water being a non-compressible fluid, when you push on it with the heart, it's going to push the blood in front of it, which pushes the blood in front of it, which is going to give you that traveling pressure wave that you can feel as pulse. Again, only going to feel that in arteries. We'll see in just a minute here. One of the things you can kind of calculate is just kind of the overall average of pressure on the blood vessels. For example, as we're seeing here, this mean arterial pressure, this is just that average force. If you're kind of calculating it throughout that whole cardiac cycle where it goes up and down, this is going to be about the average force that is on those blood vessels. So it's a pretty straightforward formula. It's your diastolic number, that diastolic pressure, which would be about 80 in most cases, times about 1/3 of that pulse pressure, because again, that pulse pressure is going to be a spike and drop back down. So we're just taking 1/3 of that to get this average. So this mean arterial pressure on a normal blood pressure, for example, would be 80 plus that pulse pressure, which is 40, divide that by 3, and that gives you an average of about 93 in terms of milligrams of mercury, and that is that mean arterial pressure. We need at least about 60 for mean arterial pressure in order to have sufficient blood flow that's traveling. Any less than that, and we're going to have trouble moving the blood throughout the body. We're going to see as we get further and further along through the blood vessels, that pressure is going to drop. It's going to drop more. As we get to the capillaries, we're going to see almost no pulse pressure, and we're going to see the overall arterial pressure at this point is about 40 millimeters of mercury, where we are seeing the spike of that at about 120, closer to the heart. At the venous end, we're going to see this is going to drop down a lot more to about 20 millimeters of mercury, and we're going to see this is going to be important to us later on when we're actually dealing with how water is basically forced out in the capillaries and reabsorbed, and we will talk about that as when I get to that in a subsequent show here. As we get back to venous blood pressure, we're going to kind of see, because it's went through the capillaries and we've reached that low pressure, we've at this point pretty much lose all pulse pressure, and it's going to be a very consistent pressure going on there. In those smaller venules, it's going to be a little bit higher, still about 20 millimeters of mercury, and as we're getting close to back to the heart, it's almost to a 0. One of the things I always kind of, when we're usually in class, kind of make the point of is you can tell if you've severed an artery or a vein. Arteries, because they have pulse pressure, if you were to sever an artery, it's gonna spurt, where if you were to sever a vein, it's going to do this kind of continuous leak out, a pretty consistent flow, versus like this spray out, go back, spray out, go back that you would see with an artery. One of the things that helps with that venous blood flow, and we've talked about this a little bit already, is the fact that those arteries and veins run in between the muscle bodies, and because of that, and with the one-way valves that we've talked about in the veins, we're going to see that when you contract a muscle, for instance, it's going to push that blood back towards the heart. And that's one of the things that helps to, because there is that kind of lack of pressure in this venous system, at least not very much of it, it's going to help maintain that blood flow. And this is also part of the reason where I talked about before with like the deep vein thrombosis. When you sit a long time, when you're not contracting those muscles, that gets blood pooling and can lead to those issues with the abnormal clotting if you're prone to it. And again, just kind of showing you that idea here. I guess I don't have it. So you can kind of see right here the one-way valves. When these muscles contract, it is going to push blood up and back towards that heart. The other thing that's going to do this is breathing. The fact that the diaphragm is going to drop down, it's going to create a lower pressure in here when you're taking a breath in, which is going to help to draw when you're going and taking a breath in. It's going to help move fluids into that thoracic cavity. So that is another way that we're helping to move blood back towards the heart. So that skeletal muscle pump, along with the breathing, acting as a respiratory pump, these are two mechanisms by which we are actually going to help return blood to the heart due to the fact that that system is a little bit lower pressure. And again, just showing the idea right here with that respiratory pump, how this is happening and how it's going to help move blood back towards the heart. Again, there is definitely a gradient in this. Like I said, that mean arterial pressure is going to be highest close to the heart, about that 93, and as we move throughout the vessel system, it's going to drop lower and lower. It is this difference in gradient, that higher pressure pushing this fluid to the areas of lower pressure, that is going to move this blood throughout the system. We can alter this by changing our cardiac output. Again, anything that is going to increase flow out of the heart is going to increase this pressure gradient and move that blood faster or quicker through the system. Maintain that pressure gradient so the blood keeps going. So if we're actually looking at how blood pressure is measured, one of the things you'll see is there's the cuff going around the arm. And what this is going to do is you're going to build up pressure in this cuff, and that pressure is going to squeeze on the arm and kind of counteract the pressure of the blood going through the blood vessel. So in order to actually measure this, you kind of see when you pump the cuff up, you're going to pump above what you think your highest number would be in terms of the millimeters of mercury. So you might pump the cuff up to 150 millimeters of mercury, let's say. As you start letting air out of that, that pressure is going to drop, that pressure is going to drop. We're listening with a stethoscope on the arteries in the crook of the elbow here, and what you're going to hear is the first time the pressure in the blood vessel gets enough to push blood through that. As we said before, anytime you kind of have pressure on a valve and it's going to make a vibration to squeeze stuff through there, like a regurgitation in the heart, it's going to make a sound. This sound is called a Korotikoff sound. So what you're going to listen for to do that first number is when the first time that pressure is high enough in the artery and the cuff is dropped enough, that might be the 120 number, you're going to get a little of blood that goes through. It's going to make this little click sound in the stethoscope that you're going to hear. And then each beat until you get down to that diastolic number, you're going to hear that sound each time. What's going to happen is that pressure in the cuff drops and drops. Sooner or later, it's going to get down to, let's say, 80 is your diastolic number. If it gets down to that 80, you're going to see on that last one there, that'll be the last time it makes a sound. At that point, the pressure inside the artery is actually higher than what's in the cuff, so the artery is fully open. It's just that time in between the systolic and the diastolic number where you're having each pulse pressure being enough to cause blood to go through there and actually make a sound. And that's how we actually measure this. And you can see it on the bottom graph here on the screen here. You're going to get these pulse pressures, but sooner or later, you can see as you get to the capillaries and veins, that pulse pressure goes away. So we generally are going to measure this pulse pressure on the brachial artery. It's the easiest one to do. That being said, you can cuff certain other regions and do it there as well if need be. Blood flow velocity, one of the things you're going to kind of see is this, not something I'm as worried about, but blood flow velocity is just kind of saying how fast is the blood moving through these vessels. It's really relative to the overall cross-sectional area. I mean, the aorta is the biggest vessel, so biggest diameter. That being said, if you add up a lot of the smaller arteries, they're going to get a bigger diameter. If you add up a lot of the capillaries, it's going to be a very large diameter. And to me, in terms of exchange, if you want things getting in or out of the bloodstream, you want that blood, just like I would say with like traffic and crossing the street. If you're going to have a lot of exchange across the street, you want the traffic moving the slowest. And what we see with there being large and large amounts of overall capillaries, the actual cross-sectional is the biggest on those capillaries, and we're actually going to see the slowest blood flow velocity in the capillaries. So it is actually going to be fastest in the arteries. In terms of the blood flow here, it's going to be fastest here. We're going to see it dip when it gets down to the capillaries and then increase as it starts getting back to the heart. This is going to allow at the capillaries for most of that exchange to take place. And we can kind of see it on this graph here. If you're actually looking at the cross-sectional area, that is this blue graph right here. You can see the cross-section overall. If you add up all the capillaries, we have a lot bigger cross-sectional area. It allows that blood to slow down. So you can see in those smallest vessels, especially the capillaries where you want exchange to take place, is where the blood is moving the slowest. And then as it gets closer to the heart again, you can see it starts to pick speed back up. So again, just to remind everybody, blood pressure is that force of the blood against the vessel walls. Going to be highest, closest to the heart in those areas like the aorta. And as we get further and further away, it's going to get less and less. Again, especially in the arteries, we're going to have that difference between the systolic and diastolic blood pressures, giving us that pulse pressure. And it's this mean arterial pressure gradient that is giving us the ability to move this blood through from the arteries all the way back to the veins, having that overall gradient. Again, normally we're measuring this in the brachial artery. In terms of medical fields here, looking for that systolic, that highest pressure during ventricular systole is that number. The diastolic pressure being the lowest during the cardiac cycle when the ventricles are in diastole is generally going to give us about that 125/80 number. Again, numbers higher than that is where we're really going to start getting to hypertension. And again, pulse pressure highest, closest to the heart. The further we get away from the heart, the less and less we see those differences in pulse pressure.